Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt. Happy post-Thanksgiving.
Yes, welcome back to the DMZ. We took a week off. I didn't hear many complaints, but that rare week off for us. We don't take many.
Well, hardest working dialogue online TV show left-right duo in the business.
Yeah, I think you could fairly say that. I think that's probably true.
But while we were gone, you know, things happened. There's stuff to talk about. And you had a piece just yesterday about the latest James O'Keefe nonsense, which I've said I'm loath to even say his name. I feel like it should be already understood that whatever he produces is a lie, and it's not even worth going through the fact check process. Just to be the man's credibility is so shredded, there's no point even discussing him.
Well, I think he has had some successes, but the batting average. Okay, I'll put it to you this way. And speaking of batting average, in baseball, if you get a hit 3 out of 10 times, you go to Cooperstown. In surgery, if you have a successful operation 30% of the time, that's probably, I don't want you as my doctor. And so my point here is that depending on what you're doing, there's a more of a margin of error. I'm of the opinion that when you're dealing with journalism and this business, you're walking a high wire, and everybody makes mistakes, but any mistake could destroy your credibility. And when you have
But these aren't mistakes. This is oops, I'm sorry, I deceptively edited a video and completely misrepresented the subject. The enterprise is based upon duplicity. The whole premise is I'm going to infiltrate places, capture footage, deceptively edit it, and do so that fits a conservative narrative regardless of what the actual facts are. That's the point of the project.
True, and I wrote a column criticizing him, so it's hard for me to defend him, but I'll play devil's advocate here. So, look, everything you said is true, but if you believe that the Washington Post and the mainstream media are inherently bogus and biased, then, engaging in a clandestine effort whereby they would take the word of a woman who is making up a story and run with it would demonstrate that they were not legit. That would paint the mainstream media in a negative light. Now, ironically, of course, the Washington Post did due diligence, properly vetted the story, and I think they end up looking quite good. But I disagree with the tactics of O'Keefe just philosophically. But I think there is a rationale for it if you buy that premise I've just established.
So what was the thrust of your piece in the Daily Beast?
Well, the thrust of my piece was the fact that it turns out his Project Veritas, ironically named, is I think raked in over $1 million from, it's a nonprofit, presumably from conservative donors.
And O'Keefe makes about $300,000, right?
Yeah. And so
crime pays.
And so what I did was sort of talk about the other, there are other people who are trying. I'll give you an example. When I used to work at townhall.com, there was my intern was a guy named Adam Brickley who had started the Draft Sarah Palin movement /website, and when she got picked to be John McCain's running mate, she phoned him and thanked him personally. He went on, I think it was Colbert at the time. It might have been The Daily Show. So he had some of this buzz, and he couldn't get a job. He couldn't get hired. And I think he ended up doing I don't know what he's doing now, but he ended up doing some sort of, finally, he ended up catching on, I think, with Heritage Foundation, basically setting up the logistics of rooms when other speakers would come to speak. And so this is something I've been interested in for a long time, is why is it that the conservative donors will give millions of dollars to something like O'Keefe, but then you have other people who are really struggling to start, different types of journalistic operations and enterprises who can't get the time of day from these donors. That was sort of the angle I took, is why this is a microcosm of some larger problems in the conservative movement, including the fact that the donors, a lot of these conservative donors, we tend to think of them as being these sophisticated cosmopolitan business people who are strategic. Actually, a lot of them are much closer to what you would think of as the base of the Republican Party, the Donald Trump base.
Well,
I think it's a
it's been a long time since I've discussed these issues. For a time on the left, there was this great frustration. There probably still is. I just haven't had conversations with folks about it in a long time, because the donor game on the left is different. There's a lot of demands from progressive donors to show metrics of success. To they don't cut blank checks. Go have a ball. It's usually for discrete projects with limited time frames and clear metrics of success. And so a lot of folks on the left saying, you're not. This is not the model of the right. The right donors, they just throw money at everything. They're just throwing stuff at the wall. They let their kids run free and see what kind of blood they can draw. So on one hand, you're saying they're being amateurish.
Well, I think it's like the 1%. I mean, yes, I think that conservative donors, when they find somebody like a James O'Keefe, they give them a lot of money, and rather than having them engage in some boring, incremental, strategic plan, will let them engage in sort of flashy, splashy stunts. And I think the other thing, though, is that O'Keefe is trying. This was quite telling. O'Keefe immediately, like after this sting went bust, after the Washington Post basically blew the whistle on the sting, he immediately sent out a fundraising email. So I think it's possible that O'Keefe, given his druthers, might want to work on some long-term investigative journalistic piece, but because of the nature of the quote-unquote business, he's a nonprofit, but the quote-unquote business that he's in, feels the need to jump on whatever story is hot right now, and it happened to be the Roy Moore story, to latch onto that story to raise money. It's no way to run a railroad, and I would argue it's counterproductive for conservatism. And believe it or not, Brent Bozell, who is, no rhino. He runs the Media Research Center and a group called For America. They have what's called his group, MRC, has the Dishonors Awards. So he's big on media bias, and he has come out and criticized O'Keefe for harming the movement. So it's interesting.
But I imagine there are still conservative donors that, certainly in the era of Trump, but I do think this mentality precedes Trump. Who cares what the eggheads say about truth and credibility? You go out there, you try to string up as many people as you can.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll get a Planned Parenthood. Now, look, even Planned Parenthood, I would argue, was another case of deceptive editing. They're not really selling baby parts on a baby part market. But even from a conservative vantage point, this has generated this desire to defund Planned Parenthood, which has still not happened. So you haven't even gotten the policy success of defunding Planned Parenthood. But I'm sure there are folks on the right that look at that overall as a win. That we got Planned Parenthood, we got them to we got them knocked on their heels, we besmirched their reputation, and if we get one of those of every 10 James O'Keefe stunts, that's a win. Let's keep these folks on the run.
Yeah, no, look, you did say something about like throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks, and I do think that's part of the philosophy, and it's interesting. It's that basically, the notion that you with great power comes great responsibility, that that your batting average matters is kind of antiquated in this new paradigm that O'Keefe and Trump operate in, and Bannon. And so It's okay if they're wrong and embarrassed. If they're embarrassingly wrong 9 times, one time they're going to hit a home run. They can strike out 9 times, but if they hit a home run one time, they will declare victory and they'll consider that a win. So it's a different way of viewing things. I mean, from my standpoint, it ruins your credibility when you repetitively get things so wrong.
Now, this latest attempt at deceptiveness involves the Alabama race, trying to make what the Washington Post look like it was paying for stories to discredit Roy Moore. Roy Moore has an ad out where he calls them all false allegations, and he pins it on Mitch McConnell and Schumer and Pelosi. But he's being wildly outspent on the airwaves by Doug Jones, and in mid-November, you had several polls that had Doug Jones up. Now, this week, we've seen 2 or 3 polls that have more backup. And the race is 2 weeks away. It's hard to poll this race because you don't know exactly what the turnout profile is going to be. It's a special election. Who knows who's motivated to vote and who's not motivated to vote? But is there a sense that, as ridiculous as it is, that Moore should get the benefit of the doubt, he's got the edge still in the race?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of prognosticating who's going to win, horse race sort of stuff, I've always thought the edge goes to Moore. I think Jones has a chance to win, but I've always thought that despite all the scandal, that Moore has a better than 50-50 chance of winning. So I don't think that's a surprise. I would say that, tying it back to the James O'Keefe story, look, if they could get if they could plant a disreputable allegation that was proven to have been false in the Post, it would seem to discredit all the allegations, right? And that would create a perception that all the allegations, at least a shadow of doubt, you know what I mean, or whatever the criteria is that they're going for. Like, voters don't have to like Roy Moore, they don't have to believe Roy Moore, but if they could just question the allegations, this would do it. Will Salatan over at Slate remembered that at some point Roy Moore promised that there was going to be some information coming out about the media that would, exonerate him to some degree, and O'Keefe now claims that he's working on something about the Washington Post, that they preempted his story by blowing the whistle on this sting operation. And so who knows what's going to come out. And I think the one question I would have is, was O'Keefe actually coordinating with, Breitbart and or Roy Moore's campaign?
I mean, that was Salatin's inference, that Moore's statement seemed to come out at the same time as, now that we know, O'Keefe was launching this operation.
Yeah, when you do the timeline, it seems to match up. And I think it's different. So in my opinion, if you are a nonprofit who ostensibly is doing investigative journalism, it's one thing to lie and try to make the Washington Post look bad. That's a problem, but that's one thing. But if you were doing that in coordination with a political campaign to try to help a political candidate, A, win an election, and B, potentially cover up credible allegations of whatever, some people say pedophilia, that's a different level, right? I mean, that's not just a botched stunt. That becomes a more serious thing.
Now, there was this article in the Federalist, the conservative site The Federalist, I forget the woman's name that wrote it, that basically made an argument for, character is important, but it's not everything. And it really comes down to,
overrated.
If a person's going to vote the way you want them to vote, who cares what their personal character is? If they're a child molester, hey, so what? They're going to vote the way you want them to vote. I mean, I'm purposely oversimplifying her point, but that is, I think, sort of the nut of it. It was a very contorted justification for why it's okay to vote for Roy Moore. Do you think, your personal biases aside, I know you're not Team Moore. You don't want child molesters in the conservative movement, the Republican Party, but is it better for the Republican Party to have Roy Moore win this seat, have that vote in the Senate, and have personal scandal not be discrediting for Republican politicians? Or is it better long run for Republicans? You know what? Doug Jones wins the seat. It's for a couple of years. It's just finishing out Sessions' term. There's almost either he votes like a Republican or he doesn't if we boot him out in 2020. And the party is now at least partially inoculated from being seen as the party of child molestation. I mean, it's like he'd be the first. Teddy Hastert wasn't that long ago. At least then you didn't know he was a child molester.
Right.
But you worry that this reputation is worse than getting a vote for a couple of years. Where do you fall on that? What's the political benefit either way?
Well, I would say two things. One, it's a shame that this became a binary choice, because I do think it might have been possible for Republicans to find a way to get rid of Roy Moore, replace him, run Jeff Sessions comes back and runs a write-in campaign. It's the governor postpones the election. I mean, there
is a write-in campaign now. There's a guy named Lee Busby who used to work for John Kelly before he was in the Trump administration. He's running a last-minute write-in campaign. So there's somebody.
Yeah, but he can't win. The best he could do is help elect Jones. So it really is a binary choice, and so now with that. To answer your question, I think this really parallels the Donald Trump. I mean, this is the same in so many ways. This is the same kind of calculation that you would make about Donald Trump. If you'd asked me a year ago, is the conservative movement better off if Donald Trump wins or loses? I think in the long run, it's probably better if the Republican loses. In the short run, I mean, you could certainly make an argument that there is a narrow window of opportunity to put points on the board, and that that window is closing rapidly, and you got to make hay while the sun shines, and you got to pass tax reform for one thing. So I think in the long run, the long run is different than the short run, but Republicans might be saying, was it Keynes who said in the long run we're all dead?
Now, I had a piece in Politico over the holiday break called "Why 2020 Will Be the Year of the Woman," which really isn't meant to say 2018 won't be a year of the woman. And I got some folks, on the left saying, why did we get one special year in 2020? And that really wasn't the argument. I got folks on the right saying, why are you only talking about Democratic women? Why aren't you talking about Nikki Haley? And the premise of the piece was about how this is going to affect the 2020 presidential race. If you think Nikki Haley is going to primary Donald Trump, I guess I haven't seen any evidence of that. But before I kind of delve into the meat of that piece, is there a 2020 risk that Trump's already we're being reminded of the allegations against him of sexual misconduct, and if you have Roy Moore in the Senate, you'll have more evidence that this is a party that excuses this behavior. Democrats at least are pushing against their own, trying to get them out, and you're not seeing the same thing on the right. Would that even further bolster a female nominee versus Trump to say, we're not a nation that excuses this kind of behavior? Does Moore's election run that risk of the party being branded in that way?
Well, I would say that I really think Democrats have hurt their cause in this. I think it's very hard to. It's incredibly muddy, because you've got the Conyers stuff. You had Nancy Pelosi going on Meet the Press, refusing to say that he should step down. You've got the Al Franken story, which every couple days it seems like there are more people who come forward. I think he's held at least 2 press conferences now. So this could have been, with Roy Moore, this could have been a very clean shot where it was a stark contrast, but it's not stark at all. I think it's very muddy. Having said that, there's a real question as to who gets elected president. And one argument is that it's somebody just like the last guy, right? So like Marco Rubio would have been our version of Barack Obama. I think more likely is you get the exact opposite. So Donald Trump was the exact opposite of Barack Obama. And so who's the exact opposite of Donald Trump? You can make a good argument that a woman would be. And so I think, yeah, but the question is, remember Barack Obama got 2 terms, and so did George Bush, and so did Bill Clinton. It could be that we don't get the backlash, the backlash candidate until 2024.
Well, I just have a quick point about Conyers and Franken. Pelosi, since the initial comment she made meet the press, has said, I've heard from one of his accusers personally, and I believe the accuser. There's some reporting to suggest that Pelosi's initial comments were not designed to give him cover, but as part of a strategy to nudge him out gracefully, just to get him to go out on seemingly his own terms. So I just think we don't know yet how that's going to, that might not be correct, but I think we don't quite know how that's going to play out.
It's totally plausible, but I'm talking about the perception. Yeah. And the perception, I think, is that these are all these guys are corrupt. Let me bring this up. This is just a quick side issue. But I was just reading today, one of Conyers' defenders was saying, hey, look, we've all walked in on him in his underwear. He changes. The next room is his dresser. And I'm like, is he one? I don't know if he's one of those guys who sleeps in his Capitol Hill office. Like I know Paul Ryan does, for example, or sometimes does. Tell me another job where you just get to sleep in your office. Like that seems like a weird thing to me, and I think maybe it's time for us to get rid of that.
Well, I think it's been argued that we pay your salary, not to, we pay for your office, not to have that be your home, and right, get a free home from the taxpayer.
Right, and that's a very legitimate argument. But I would say, I don't even know if Conyers lives in his office. That was my. That's what I assume.
I don't know the Conyers story there.
Based on the fact that he changes clothes in there. But my question is, doesn't that give him an excuse to be walking around half dressed? The fact that it's also his house, and the fact that
no, I mean, there's clear evidence of unprofessional behavior here, and my guess is he's not going to be around for too much longer. Franken is a bit more of a complicated story, but
Charlie Rose, one of the things that Charlie Rose allegedly did was have some of these young women who worked for him come to his house or cabin or something and do work there. And then he would happen to come out of the shower with a towel, something like that. Well, if you live in your Capitol Hill office, that's a more convenient move, to oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was here. I don't know, but just that seems to me as one more reason that they probably shouldn't be living in their offices.
So I want to pivot to me. And
want to talk about me.
So the premise of the piece I wrote in Politico is, how is this going to impact the Democratic primary? Is there now unstoppable momentum for a female nominee? Because the Democratic Party is determined not just to punish Trump, but to clean its own house, and therefore that means having no trace of anyone, an assurance that not someone's going to have their own transgression, but a more symbolic break from the past to say we're the party that doesn't put up with this. You are probably going to have more than one woman candidate. There are 4 in the Senate, I think, actively pondering it. Warren, Kamala Harris, Kristen Gillibrand, and Amy Klobuchar, I think, are all actively considering. You don't have a lot of governors. There's only 2 Democratic female governors in the country right now. Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island and Kate Brown, Oregon. Neither one's considered presidential possibilities. maybe you'd have a governor that wins in 2018 that gets kind of lightning in a bottle. I didn't explore that in this article, but that's a theoretical possibility. And then you have people muse about Oprah and Sheryl Sandberg, but there's no evidence they're actually doing anything. So the most likely possibilities are Warren, Harris, Klobuchar, Gillibrand. And you have a Democratic primary electorate that is heavily female. It's almost 60% female. And you have men who are saying, Jeet here, the New Republic, said Democrats should resolve now that we will have a woman candidate in 2020. We need to have a clean break. The only way to fully avenge the horror of Trump and heal the wound that he has inflicted on us is by a woman president. I do
have to say, this whole scandal does not help the cause of your boy Joe Biden.
Well, so I get into that. So so you have all these factors that elevate women in of itself. You have the two big, two Democratic frontrunners, obviously early, but in early polling, it's Bernie and Biden. Bernie has had, well, on the positive side, there is a strain of feminism that is intertwined with democratic socialism, and people who made the case in 2016 that the feminist vote is Bernie Sanders because he is not going to subjugate women in a capitalist system the way Hillary Clinton would. Bernie won with young women resoundingly, women under 34. And so he could well replicate that in 2020. Joe Biden is known for passing the Violence Against Women Act in 1994. He was, and has defended that over the past 20 years. He made a huge difference in reducing the rates of domestic violence. He was part of the campus sexual assault policies of the Obama administration, which now Betsy DeVos is rolling back, and Biden's been a prominent critic of what DeVos is doing. So he has credibility, too, with feminist organizations and feminist voters. However, Bernie endorsed an anti-abortion candidate for the Omaha mayor's race last spring, got a lot of flack from NARAL over that. He has said post-16, being a woman candidate's not enough. That rankled the ears of some Democratic women. And Joe Biden's taking it in the teeth over his handling of the Anita Hill hearings, how that became a trial of Anita Hill. Didn't bring in corroborating witnesses. Biden recently said he apologizes for what she went through. Anita Hill said that apology is insufficient. He's still not taking ownership of his actions. He still isn't taking account for him not calling these other witnesses. So there are differing narratives for both of them. So if you could consolidate around a single female candidate, I think that candidate could overcome whatever base of support that Biden and Bernie will retain. I mean, they still have pretty loyal followings. But when you have four nominees, that becomes a harder proposition. I mean, obviously, it's theoretically possible to have more than one woman in the top tier. But if Bernie and Biden are crowding out space, or maybe some other guys gets ahead of steam, the pool of donors and volunteers who are adamant about having a female nominee, if there's more than one, that pool of people starts to divide. So the end of my piece is the way this is going to work is one has to be the best. One has to be a superstar. Maybe that's unfair. I mean, it's unfair that
this is like the lane theory, right? Like,
well, it is lane theory.
The conservative lane, with establishment lane. There's a woman lane,
right?
And according to Bill Scher.
And I think we will get to a point where that is not the case, where it's not a criteria that there is a woman, and therefore it would be just like men. You got a bunch of men, you got a bunch of women. Who's in the top tier? We'll see. I think in this case, because you have potentially a Biden-Bernie factor. I mean, they have challenges because of the post-Weinstein effect, but they have their bases still. The pool of people who want a woman candidate is inherently finite.
Well, if they're voting for them at least partly based on gender, then it stands to reason that would be that more than one candidate would crowd that field. You need to own that niche. So who do you, of those four, and I know this is early, but if Bill Scher, who's winning the Bill Scher primary? Let's put it that way. Of those four.
Well, I can't say. The premise of my piece is none of these four have a clear, overwhelming advantage over the others. Someone has to do something to break out of the pack. The closest one to having an edge is Warren. If you look at the few polls that have been done, she's the only one that has double digits.
And she's got the Native American thing going for her. So she's got an ethnic appeal.
Well, she may get a backlash from that to the extent that people are mad that Republicans keep calling her Pocahontas. And
she's got senior citizens with her, but she's going to fight off Bernie and Biden for that vote.
Well, but I mean, here's the issue. So
I'm just trying to get comments going. At this
I mean, Warren has the closest thing to a national following of the four. She has the sharpest, most finely honed economic populist message. But that comes with a downside. If Bernie's running, she's competing with Bernie for economic populist votes. You know, she can try to argue, I'm the more electable choice of the two. I can unify women the way Bernie can't. I can play, I don't have the socialist tag, so I can play better in red states. But Bernie can say, you can't out-social the socialists. If you want the real deal, I'm the real deal. So that's a complication for her. The other complication for Warren is, where's the evidence she can win African-American votes? I mean, that was the linchpin to Hillary's victory. The delegate lead was insurmountable after winning the black belt states in the South. Now, I don't want to say that Kamala Harris has inherent claim to those votes. She may not. You know, there may be plenty of choices for African-American voters. They may not vote out of racial loyalty. They may vote for plenty of other white candidates. You also might have Cory Booker competing for those votes. But she would have some potential edge there that Warren will not. And Harris comes from California, which is no great help in a general election, but it's a massive delegate prize in the Democratic primary. So if she could win California and she could win black belt states, that's a hell of a head of steam for Kamala Harris. She's also going to get hit time and time again by the Bernie-crat left that see her as the donor class candidate, Wall Street candidate. She has a book on crime that the socialist magazine Jacobin is saying shows that she's not progressive enough. So she has her challenges too. Then you get to Gillibrand and Klobuchar. Gillibrand made a lot of noise, calling out Bill Clinton last week, which Claire Moore at The Atlantic and 538 said this was a brilliant play on her part. Clear, biting the hand that feeds you is a good play. It's a clear break from the Democratic establishment that will play well with younger voters.
That was her sister Soldier moment.
Right. But she was a more conservative congresswoman in her younger days. She was against gun control. She was against immigration reform. It's going to get thrown back at her in the primary. And then you have Klobuchar as the least liberal of the four, but the other one from the breadbasket from Minnesota. She can say, hey, you want to beat Donald Trump? You want in Middle America? You need someone from Middle America. And so all these folks might attack each other over these points, not to mention the flack they might get from the other men in the race. So it's not a glide path. Someone has to be the best. Someone has to show I can handle I can address all these weaknesses within the primary electorate, and I can show I can handle Donald Trump in the swing states. Whatever they throw at me, Pocahontas or whatever, I know how to turn it back on them. They need to prove it.
You know who I think would be great is Al Franken. He's funny. He's from the breadbasket. Minnesota's not the breadbasket. Did you say breadbasket?
It's breadbasket.
Where's Klobuchar from? Minnesota. I don't think that's the breadbasket. That's the Plains.
Well, anyway, Plains and breadbasket. There's overlap there. It's a bit Rust Belt too.
Anyway, yeah. So no, again, there's no candidate for me. I feel I would like to embrace a.
You want to go Klobuchar?
I have to look into a record. I don't think I could, but I'd like to embrace an option against Donald Trump. Assuming Ben Sass. If Ben Sass runs in the primary, well, we know where that's. We know what's going to happen there.
He will lose. So you'll be stuck with what your Democratic choice is.
No, I'm saying, but I would have a guy then, a candidate then.
Klobuchar has said that if you are against abortion, that doesn't mean you're disqualified from being a Democrat.
I'll have to check into her background.
And believe me, someone's going to mention that in the primary.
Yeah.
But that's going to be part of her argument that look, you need to hew to the middle to beat Trump, and that's not the predominant feeling of the Democratic electorate. But this may not be a majority game; this may be a niche game. And can she hold a niche? Now, look, I think Biden gets in Klobuchar's way in a big way, because he's going to also be making a case for blending populist themes and centrist themes.
So it sounds like you think Biden is running. I mean, you think it's...
I think Biden is running. I don't think Biden's... I mean, as much as the Anita Hill thing is a complication for him, I don't think he's going to let that get in his way. He feels like I got plenty of feminist street cred with my legislative record that came after that.
What about...
I can talk about that.
What about all the video of him groping women publicly?
Well, there was a
groping
piece.
May not be the right word, but
what's the thing? There was a piece in Huffington Post that did criticize him about that. That said Biden would be a terrible candidate in post-Weinstein America. Anita Hill. Plus, look at his handsy ways on the swearing-in line. Look at how uncomfortable this person was and that person was. I think some of those uncomfortable moments are dramatized. Like there's one where he's kissing a teenage girl who's the daughter of someone being sworn in, and she kind of pulls away a little bit. But you see it in slow motion. It looks much worse in slow motion than it does in real time.
But the ads will be in slow motion. The YouTube clips will be in slow motion.
There are weaknesses for all of them. All of them have things they're going to have to overcome. The argument I would say for Biden is he has been through the ringer the most of everybody.
No doubt.
And I think he's going to be more capable of weathering the blows because he's been there before. He's not going to flinch or crumble in the face of this stuff. And I think he has his longevity in office is both a positive and a negative. He's got a massive record, plenty of attack lines. But he's also navigated these cultural divides for a long time. Imperfectly, but he has experience doing it. And I think he's not going to be flustered by the minefield that awaits any of these candidates.
What does President Barack Obama do if Joe Biden, his vice president, runs for president?
I think he stays out. I don't think he's going to tip the scales. And that's too dicey.
What do you think of that? Don't you feel like he should give him... I mean, I'm not saying he has to stump for him right away, but don't you think he's earned a pro forma endorsement?
Biden might feel so, but... Obama stayed out of Bernie Hillary, until it was done. I mean, I think he made a couple of comments that seemed to show a bit of an edge.
But he was a sitting president then,
right.
too. I mean, it's a little different.
It's still a Bigfoot move to endorse, and with potential backlash. Hey, why are you trying to short circuit a debate that we're having amongst primary voters? I think Obama would try to. He might say, "Look, I love Joe Biden. He was a great vice president, but I'm not going to be endorsing someone like that."
Gotcha. All right. So let's keep going.
All right. So before one last thing we should talk about is the tax bill, which I know is a moving target. So we always run the risk of
It's 10:30 on a Wednesday morning.
I mean, I guess they're moving towards a vote next week. A vote on the Senate floor.
Want to do it, yeah.
I mean, I know even if they scheduled it today, there'd be a certain amount of hours that would go till a final vote. So I'd assume it couldn't be any earlier than next week. And it cleared Senate Finance Committee. You're seeing Ron Johnson say, "Oh, they tell me they're going to address my pass-through business concerns," which is essentially a small business concern. You see Bob Corker saying, "I said I want a trigger mechanism, so if the revenue doesn't come in the way we expect, that the tax cuts can be suspended, so we don't bust a hole in the deficit." They told me we have an agreement in principle on that, but all these things come with downsides. If you're helping Ron Johnson on pass-throughs, that costs money. You're cutting more taxes on the smaller businesses. That blows a bigger hole in the deficit. Yep. If you're getting the trigger mechanism, you got some conservatives that say, wait a second, there's no guarantee there's going to be a tax cut for everybody. I'm out if that's the case.
Well, and that's, that's actually a big important thing. I wrote a piece for the Daily Beast a couple weeks ago about why certain tax cuts, like the Reagan and Kennedy tax cuts, the JFK tax cuts, had a stimulative effect, and why the George W. Bush tax cuts did not. If you talk to supply-siders, they will say that the Bush tax cuts, for example, one of the four, there's basically four mistakes they made that I talk about in this column, but one of the mistakes was that they were automatically set to expire if they weren't reauthorized after a decade. Well, if you subscribe to supply side economic theory, it's very important. It's important for businesses and individuals to plan and invest. That's how the economy is spurred, and they're not going to plan and invest if they don't have if they don't feel comfortable planning on a certain tax marginal rate. And so this trigger mechanism would really cut at the heart of the whole point of doing the tax cut. Republicans and conservatives, supply-siders argue that we have to do this because although in the short term it will increase the deficit, in the long term it will stimulate the economy, create more investment, create businesses, broaden the tax base, all of those things. Well, they only happen if you do other things, including allow people to plan for the tax cut. So this would be, I don't know, like a catch-22, a self-fulfilling prophecy, whatever. It kind of blows up the whole plan. That's the problem. This is why I was worried about remember I wrote a little hand-wringing about Ron Johnson the other week where I was criticizing him, because this is like negotiating with terrorists. Like once Republican leadership starts making special carve-out deals to get one vote, it's like the game of Jenga or Rubik's Cube or something. You fix one thing and you mess something else up.
And they've only gotten this far with it.
We'll give you a bridge. We'll give you a bridge in your state if you vote for this tax bill, but don't change the tax bill to win over the votes because it's just going to create other problems.
Well, that's why the thrust of the coverage that I've seen is, this bill has momentum. They're getting reinsurances to people. I got a Senate Finance Committee, but they've gotten it this far without actually producing the legislative language that squares all of these different side deals. So I just don't see how, when you get to the Senate floor vote, this is the final vote, unless they're going to say, look, everybody, this is not fully baked, but we got to get to House Senate conference. Yeah, conference. So just don't kill this now. We got to move this along. If this sits around for months and months, Democrats will pick it apart. We'll start to get more phone calls telling us it's terrible. We got to do this on a quick time frame. So don't nitpick it to death now. I mean, that's the only way I would see you would get past these obstacles.
With the first House Obamacare repeal bill, where they started making deals, and they would cut a deal with the Freedom Caucus, and then they would lose a moderate, Wednesday group or Tuesday group or whatever day they meet. And you pick somebody up, you lose somebody. And it's a bad idea to do that. And so that's what concerns me. You're right, there is momentum for this. But if they start trying to play that game, it doesn't turn out well.
And even if it does get out of the Senate, do you think that the House Senate differences are reconcilable?
Well, the House, you mean the difference between the House and the Senate?
Yeah.
No, I think that I think it's definitely possible that this thing that the president signs this bill, by Christmas or whatever, or in the new year. I mean, I think that I don't think they're irreconcilable now.
So one side would have to surrender to the other.
I mean, there's going to have to be negotiations and compromises, but the House passed theirs pretty quickly. Not a lot of, I think probably keeping the Senate happy is remember, the Senate was the bottleneck for health care.
I mean, the Senate usually has the edge in these battles because they have the thinner margins, but the Senate goes bigger on the state and local tax deduction question. I think it fully eliminates it, and partial on the House side. House has vulnerable Republicans in high tax states like California, New York, New Jersey. If they had to hew to the Senate side of that, you might lose House votes there. If you have to go to the House side on that, well, you're just giving up some money that you're going to have to offset somewhere else. And I don't know if they know where that money's coming from.
Yeah, that's going to have to be worked out. I mean, I honestly, I think that politically speaking, they could probably pass it through the House without fixing this state and local tax thing. From a policy standpoint, I mean, I understand that they're trying to raise revenue, but I mean, it makes me think about moving to Florida or Texas. I mean,
one thing that I don't think is a hang-up for the bill passing, but I think is a problem down the line. Remember, I wrote the piece about 1909, how passing it can be even worse than not passing it.
Again, I'm pretty familiar with the 1909
paying Aldrich tariff.
Yeah.
So there's a graphic in the New York Times today from the Upshot, which look, you can say on average a middle class family is going to get a tax cut. It doesn't mean that every middle class family gets a tax cut. There's part of the argument about the middle class piece of this is the middle class tax cuts expire in 2027. The corporate ones don't, and so the Republican counter that as well. That's just a gimmick for now. There's no way Congress is going to let that slip in 2027. So don't worry about that. The Times graphic was about 2018. What happens immediately? And so they have a dot graph. Like each dot is a certain kind of family, certain income level, certain number of family members in the household. And you can see most of the dots in the middle class get a tax cut, but it's not all of them. It's not like it's 90%, 10%. It's a pretty healthy minority of middle class families that would get a tax cut immediately. And these are folks who I would think would be pretty mad right away.
You're saying they would get a tax hike?
Tax hike, yes.
Immediately.
If I said it wrong. Yeah, so you get a sizable minority of middle-class families get an immediate tax hike. I mean, you could say with Obamacare, hey, most people got health insurance, but some people felt their premiums went up. You hear those voices. They get on TV. They get quoted in the newspaper. If you're a family that gets a tax hike after this bill, you're going to be unhappy about it and vocal about it. Right. That would seem really dangerous for Republicans going into the midterm.
Well, that's why any of this stuff is inherently dangerous, because even if you fix something for the majority of the people, there's always winners and losers in a comprehensive thing like this. And it's inherent, and that is, I would argue, that is why it's so important that if Republicans do this, they do it right. So
yeah, you doing it right is tax cuts for everybody. Don't worry about the deficit. Bob Corker, shut up.
Here's my point: Republicans, supply-siders, believe that this tax bill, specifically cutting the corporate tax, will, over time, there's always going to be a lag, it's going to take a couple of years probably, over time will create growth, investment, jobs, things like that. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but they believe it will if the tax cuts are done in the Reagan-Kennedy model. Now, I know Reagan was focused on individual, not corporate, but income taxes. But Bush made some mistakes, including the tax rebates, including the sunset provision that they had to have to do it through reconciliation. So my point is, if you're going to get blamed in the short term, and if you're going to take hits politically, because there will always be losers, even if more people win, if you're going to take that short-term hit, you at least should damn well make sure that you get to properly test your theory. Mm-hmm. If supply side economics works, let's try it. Let's at least try it, right? And so if the theory is correct, then in a couple of years, right around the time Donald Trump's running for re-election, just as Reagan had, there was a recession early on in his administration, and things bounced back in time for his re-election. It was mourning again in America. The same thing could happen for Republicans and Donald Trump, unless you do things like put a trigger. Because of course there's going to be immediate, in the short term, the deficit is going to go up. I mean, everyone knows that. Even those of us who support this know that. And so if you have a trigger, then you completely you would only get the negatives from doing this with no chance of an upside, right? At least have an opportunity for an upside if you're going to do this.
All right. Should we leave it on that note?
On that happy note.
What people should check out your work at the Daily Beast. You got a podcast to plug?
Yes. Check out the podcast Matt Lewis and the News on iTunes, and I've written some cool stuff at the Beast. I've the piece we talked about James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. I wrote a piece earlier this week about how social conservatives and feminists should team up. Good men and good women coming together, putting partisanship aside. And I have a piece coming out today about how Jimmy Fallon explains all the problems with media, explains the problem in political journalism.
So you're no longer Team Kimmel, you're Team Fallon?
Well, no, I'm not Team Fallon, but I do think it's pretty clear that Kimmel and Colbert have very shrewdly gone political and anti-Trump, and that's really paid off for them in terms of ratings. And Fallon was actually trying, probably because it's his natural inclination, just his talents are being more apolitical, and has not panned out well for him. So, anyway, check that out. And how about you, Bill? What do you got cooking?
Well, just check out the Politico piece in Politico magazine, why 2020 will be the year of the woman, and I should have a fresh podcast installment later this week.
All right.
liberalvoices.com.
Sounds good. You can listen to this show too if you don't want to look at us on iTunes. You just search for Blogging Heads, and follow us on Twitter at DMZ Show, and check us out back here next week.
All right. Take care.
All right. Thanks.